Hi, and welcome to episode number 2 of the Quill and Candle, my weekly update on my reading adventures, my writing adventures, and also sharing some tips for aspiring writers. I'm Father Roderick, I'm a priest, I'm a geek, and I am a fantasy author. Or that is, well, I hope to be, because I'm currently writing my very first fantasy novel. And that's not the only thing I'm writing. I'm also writing and publishing short fantasy stories every single day of the week. You can find them on my Substack, fatherroderick.substack.com. Last Monday, I was in Nijmegen, or Nijmegen as they say in English, which is a city not that far from here. And I was there on the occasion of the second day of Pentecost, which doesn't really exist, but here in the Netherlands, it's still a holiday. And on that second day of Pentecost, they had organized a fantasy festival in a former church. I mean, it's still a church, it's still a church building, but it's no longer used for church services. Instead, everyone can rent that gigantic space for expositions, for theater, for musical performances, and in this case, for a fantasy fair. And I was looking forward to it. It seemed to me like a small scale event. I knew that there were going to be a lot of novel, like beginning writers, first time publishers, etc. And as well as a couple of my artist friends that I have encountered on many other fantasy related occasions. And so I figured, let's just go there and have a great time. When I was about to enter the church, I was actually a little bit disturbed because there were two people on either side of the entrance screaming at me, yelling at me. What were they saying? They said, "Don't lose your soul. Don't go in there. This is not a church. This is Satan's house. You are going in there and your soul will be lost forever. The devil lives there. These are sorcerers. These are witches." And it was just one big rant against fantasy and the people that were already in the church. And I was a little bit taken aback because I was like, well, I'm a priest. I tend to visit a lot of churches, and I personally don't have anything against fantasy. Au contraire, I want to be there. I think it's a marvelous world of very creative people that tell the most amazing stories. What can possibly be wrong with that? But they just kept on pounding on everyone who wanted to enter. And then there was this lady next to me with two of her kids, and she said, "Oh, you don't want me to enter? Well, now I really am going to enter." And that was exactly how I felt too. When I stepped into the church, there was just this wonderful atmosphere in the center where in the past there used to be a congregation. There was now an open space, and they had a catwalk for cosplayers, and they also had some performances there and some lectures. And then all along the sides of the church, there were these tables with fantasy authors, artists, just an amazing variety of people. And I had a fantastic time just chatting with people. There was this group of students, and they had created a fantasy board game based on the history of that city. And it was so creative and innovative. And so I just chatted. I was like, I'm a huge board fan game. And well, the game hadn't been published yet, but they told me all about it. And then this girl asks me, "Are you a real priest or are you a cosplayer?" Which is a question I often get at fancy events like that. There's like, "No, I'm a real priest." And then she asked me, what did you think of the people outside? And I said, I was a little bit perturbed by it. I mean, they're probably, from their perspective, doing the right thing. They want to warn people that it's dangerous to meddle with sorcery and witchcraft. But this is fantasy. None of this is real. We're all kind of making up these stories. What can be possibly wrong with that? And then she told me that they actually, at the beginning of the event, had entered the church. One of them had even climbed on the, how do you call that? The place where they used to preach. And they had done a whole rant against anyone who was there, and all the visitors were like, "Wait a minute, what?" Are you guys serious? Is this an act? There were actually people that thought it was an act. And then they were gently, how do you say that, transported outside of the building where they continued to exercise their right to free speech. I always am a little bit sad when I see people react to the world of fantasy like that. And in my own life as a geek and as a fan of all these wonderful stories, every once in a while I would get attacked online. And this happened mostly years and years ago when I was doing a podcast about the deeper layers of stories like The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. And then sometimes out of the blue, people would write me these long emails telling me that they were going to call my bishop and maybe even write letters to the Vatican because I, as a priest, was leading people straight to hell. And these were not like hardcore fringe Protestants writing that. No, these were actually very conservative Catholics that said this. And you know what baffles me? If you read the Bible, if for you the Bible is the foundation of your faith, and you really take a good look at those stories, I mean, there is a lot in there that is very similar to all these fantastical tales. There are gruesome things happening in the Bible. There are just the most incredible creatures there. I mean, read the book of Revelation and tell me how different it is from the fantasy worlds that we read in today's modern fantasy. Uh, How can you possibly read the Bible and not understand that the Bible, as a collection of books from various cultures and various times, is just as much a storybook as all the imaginary tales that we tell each other in other books? Now, I'm not saying that the Bible is a fairy tale or completely made up. Um, a lot of the biblical stories are retellings of originally historical events. However, they sometimes are interpreted like centuries later, and there are layers and layers that have been added to that original account. Plus, some of the books are of a poetic nature. There are so many different literary genres in the Bible, and you cannot possibly take like the account of Genesis and then say, well, this is a journalist who was there and wrote down everything that happened. You cannot read that literally. It was never meant to be a literal account. But it is a story that expresses a very deep truth. But you have to look beyond the words and try to understand that deeper layer just as much as we do whenever we read fantasy. I mean, fantasy literature would be completely irrelevant and just escapism if it hadn't been for all those deeper layers of meaning that are woven into the tale. Why do we relate to some of these books so much? It's because they show us a mirror. They are stories about us, about the world in which we live. But in this mirror, we see them from a different perspective, in a different world, so that we can kind of rehearse reality inside those stories. And for me, that is the purpose of me writing fantasy, is I want to invite people in, just step out of this busy world that is sometimes so dark and so threatening, and step in my world and see what choices my protagonists make, see what the dangers are and what the antagonists symbolize, and think about that story. And then when you're done reading it, return to reality and then reflect on you in your own personal story in this real world that surrounds us. And hopefully the fantasy stories that we've read will inspire you to make better choices. That's the whole purpose of writing, of fiction. It is all rehearsal for our own story and our own life. I would like to share with you some of my writing adventures of this past week, and it's been an incredibly productive week, even though I have rarely sat here at my computer. A lot of my writing, most of my writing, was done while I was actually walking outside. I love that I can create fantasy stories and becoming fit at the same time. Now, I am currently training for a big walking event. It's going to take place about 4 weeks from now. And for 4 days in a row, I will have to walk 40 kilometers per day. That's about 25 miles, I think. And so, in order to be ready for that and not, get tons of blisters on my feet, I need to start walking these long distances. And so that's what I did 3 times in a row. Well, not in a row. I took 1 day in between each day. But I went out for these long walks. Like there was a walk that was 20 kilometers. Then after one rest day, I did another walk, 30 kilometers. And just yesterday, I walked for 40 kilometers. Now, that is more than 8 hours. What do I do when I'm walking? Well, I'm thinking of stories. And so the first 20-kilometer walk gave me the opportunity to think about a project that has been on my mind for over a year now. I think it was a project that I wanted to do even before I got the idea of writing this fantasy novel in medieval Ireland. And that was to write a children's book series. I've always wanted to become a children's book writer. From the age of 10, as I was browsing through the books in the local library, and I felt that, the books that I wanted to read did not exist, at least not for kids. That is how I ultimately ended up reading The Lord of the Rings. I was just so starved for fantasy literature, and the only place that I could find them was in the adult section. So the library actually granted me permission to read adult books, even though I was just 10 or 11 years old. And I always told myself, one day I will write the books that I would have wanted to read as a child. However, it was just this vague idea. It never really ended up in me really writing children's books. But recently I've been thinking about this quite a bit. The only thing missing was a good story. And so on that fantasy festival that I visited last Monday, I was talking to this lady, and she drew lots of beautiful pencil, black and white artwork of The Lord of the Rings and just fairy tales in general. And it was just this one picture that really struck me. And it showed a dragon, a cozy dragon, very relaxed. And on the back of the dragon and all around him were kittens crawling all over him. And I immediately fell in love with that image. I was like, oh, I need to have that. I mean, it combines the best of literally both worlds. The world of fantasy, like a big dragon, and the world of cats. And those two are so compatible. And on my way back, after that festival, something sparked in my mind. And it was the beginning of an idea. What if I write a children's book series about cats and dragons? Now, my immediate reaction was, somebody probably has already done that. It's such an obvious combination. So I started to look around, and I found just one author, a British author, who has written a series of books called Dragon Cat. And it's about this dragon that gets transported to, I don't know, a different time or a different place, and he is the only creature that can mount this one dragon who doesn't want to have a saddle. And it's a very imaginative idea, a very cool premise, but very different from how I pictured a story about a cat and a dragon. And so on my first walk, I was thinking, what kind of story would I write that has a cat and a dragon? And immediately I had that story, and I started to dictate it on my phone, and it grew literally into a trilogy. I've got the whole trilogy mapped out, and it's literally, I mean, I don't know where it came from, but it is a very detailed outline of 3 books, children's books. I would not write this for adults. And it's a journey of a cat and a dragon and pirates. And that's all I'm going to say about it, because I am so excited about this, and I am going to write this, but I also know that this is a trap. It's a trap. It's a trap because I also want to finish my first fantasy novel about these monks and these sisters and story magic and all that. And I know that the biggest danger for an aspiring writer is to not finish that first book and to start doing all sorts of other projects before you have finished the last page of your first book. And so I vowed to finish my first book first, and then my next project is going to be this children's book series, because this is a project that I can't really combine with all my other writing endeavors. That is not the case for the second idea that I developed during my 30-kilometer walk. Now, what was that idea? It was an idea for this choose your own adventure, this choose your own fantasy story idea that I think I talked about it last week. And so what's the idea here? I think it's going to be on a Friday. Every Friday I will write a chapter of a story. And then at the end of the chapter, it ends with a cliffhanger, and my readers get to decide what will happen next. So I'll just give you a few options. And then there is also the possibility that my readers come up with something that I haven't thought of. So I kind of create the framework of the story, and then every week there's going to be a new chapter that is based on the option that gets the most support online. I think it's such a fun story and very challenging for me as a story writer because I cannot control everything. But what I do have to do is to come up with a good premise. And I think I've just got the most amazing premise. And again, I'm not going to spoil everything. You'll have to wait for the first episode. But this is going to combine a lot of the worlds that I love and also belong to. The world of Star Wars is going to be in there. But of course, I'm not going to use any of the copyrighted terms. But I want Star Wars to be in that story. So how do I do that? I think I found a solution. There's going to be Lord of the Rings in there, but not with any of the copyrighted names. I don't want to get in trouble with the Tolkien estate. And yet it's going to be very recognizable as Middle Earth. How? You'll have to wait. There's going to be Harry Potter in there. A controversial theme right now with, all the controversy around J.K. Rowling. However, that controversy is going to be part of the story. How? You'll have to wait and see. And then, for the Time Lords among us, there's going to be Doctor Who in the story. How? It's so awesome. And so there are a couple of other franchises. There's anime in there as well. There's this amazing anime story called Frieren about this immortal elf who goes on a journey with mortal friends and starts losing them over time. It's one of the most beautiful stories that I've ever seen. And compared to any story, not just anime. And I want that to be part of the story as well. And I know I found a solution. That's all I'm going to say about it. But I developed that whole kind of framework around this choose your own adventure endeavor. And I'm almost ready to go. And then finally, just yesterday on that 40-kilometer walk, I had yet another idea, but this time it was not for like an overarching outline for a book series or anything, but instead I had a couple of story ideas. And so I wrote my very first science fiction story. I'm going to publish it soonish. But it was inspired by one of the most random things. I saw an update of someone who works in a museum, and that person was like, so I had to do a class tour, and it was so exhausting. I mean, I love my work, but these kids are so unruly. And immediately I had a story. It was just there. It involves a museum. It involves Star Trek technology, and it involves aliens. You have to read it to believe it. And I come up with this idea. I'm so glad that I have my phone, so I just dictate it, and then I have something to work with. So that, in summary, is the harvest of this week. And I couldn't be more excited about my future endeavors. As always, I have created a number of new short stories, and for those of you that are not following them on a daily basis, which I totally understand, and by the way, if you do receive those daily emails and it's a bit much, I totally understand. You can go into your Substack settings and actually deselect those daily mails, and for instance, only select this weekly Quill and Candle update. And so in every Quill and Candle episode, I will just give a short overview of the stories that I've written this week so that you can pick and choose whichever you want to read. My first story is How to Frame Your Dragon. Now, you probably know that How to Train Your Dragon is currently in theaters. It is a live-action remake of the original animated movie. From what I've heard, it's actually pretty good. It's very faithful to the original. I love that story. And so probably that was in the back of my mind when I came up with this idea of, well, how can we tell a funny story about a dragon who is always like the victim of some kind of snake oil seller or someone who is just abusing the dragon basically for his own interests. And I think it turned out to be a very funny story. I really enjoyed writing it. My second story was a story that takes place in the city of Rome, and it's a story about a small kitten who is found by a homeless person. And then they go on an adventure together, and the cat or the kitten actually ends up conquering Rome. If you want to know how, go read the story. It's called The Forgotten of Rome. The third story that I wrote is another fantasy story, and I love writing this one. It's a bit of a fairy tale. It's called The Cook, the Witch, and the Cauldron. And it's about this cook who comes across a witch who's hungry and cooks her a meal, and as a thank you, she bewitches or enchants his cauldron. And then the thing is, whatever he cooks in there, whatever animal he cooks in there, he gets the powers or the abilities of that animal. So, for instance, if you want to fly, cook a bird. Well, not a chicken because chickens can't fly, but you see what I mean. And so that blessing turns out to be a little bit of a curse. And you'll have to read the rest of the story to find out what happens. Again, I love writing that story. Then, The Three Who Followed the Flame. This is a story that I actually came up with 2 weeks ago, but it was I have like a folder on my computer with basically stories that are just there. It's stories for whenever I don't have inspiration, which so far has not occurred, but it can happen. So it's always nice to have a bit of a collection of stories that I can post whenever I don't have time, or maybe when I get sick or something like that. I always have some stories to post. And so this is a story that is very important to me because it explains the origin of story magic. You know that in my fantasy novel, there are these monks and they are called story mages. And that seems a little bit kind of strange, right? Because mages was something that was used for the Druids, for instance. That was more part of the kind of the pagan history or the Celtic pagan history of Ireland. So how can it make sense that these monks are called story mages? Isn't magic something that is opposite, or opposed to Christianity? And then, of course, there is one biblical story that could be the foundation of this, and that is the story of the Magi. I mean, the word is so obvious, and so I wrote a story about the first story mages, and it's a retelling of the story of the Magi, and I gave it a bit of a magical fantasy twist. So again, that is called The Three Who Followed the Flame. Then a totally different story. It started as a random idea. What if I tell the story of the Little Mermaid, but in the opposite direction? So the Little Mermaid, it's this mermaid who wants to become human and walk on the soil, on the earth. And what if in my story it's the opposite? It's this girl who actually wants to be down there in the depths of the sea. And what happens? I loved writing this. It's called The Girl Who Breathed Between Worlds. And some of you really appreciated that story, so check it out. And then the next story, Whispers Beneath the Skin, it's just started with one phrase in my mind. What if the expression listen to your body was literal? what if your hand, what if your thumb could actually talk to you? And what would happen? And what would it say? And what happens if you don't listen to it? And what happens if you listen to it? And very quickly that spun into a story. So there you go. Read it and hope you enjoy it. And then finally, a bonus story. I usually on Sundays only post my homily, because every homily, for those of you that are not Catholic, is it's a sermon. But my homilies are in Dutch, so I never post them online because most of you don't speak Dutch. However, I always try to tell a story, and I often refer to the stories that we all know and love. And so I started to record my Dutch homilies on my watch. I have this recording app that I also sometimes use when I'm in the woods and inspiration strikes. And then I have that, how do you say that, transcribed. And then I have it translated into English and summarized. And that's basically what I post on Sundays. However, this week it's Father's Day. And on my way back from church on my bike, I had a sudden idea for a story about Father's Day and about a father that goes on a journey, but still makes sure that his daughter gets a letter every single Father's Day. And this has never happened before. But as I was dictating the story, and even later on when I was writing it or refining the story on my computer, I choked up. I became very emotional. And maybe this is because my own father died a couple of years ago, and that story just somehow resonated. And I hope you will read it, because I think it's one of the stories that, and I don't know, it's magic. I came up with that story, and yet the story spoke to me. How does that even work? And it touched my heart very deeply. So it's called Father's Day Letters. And there you go. Those are the stories that I've written for you. I hope there are a few of them that you might want to check out. Just go to fatherroderick.substack.com to read them. This week's book review is a sequel to my last week's book review. Last week, I told you about a collection of short stories that were put in a framework of a cat who can speak and who takes a boy who works in the library of his grandfather on an adventure to save the books. The book is called The Cat Who Saved Books. There is a sequel book to this, and so I read it this week, and I really enjoyed it. It's called The Cat Who Saved a Library. It's written, just like the first one, by Sosuke Natsukawa, and it is a very similar book to the first one. But this takes place in a different environment. So the first story took place in a bookshop. This story takes place in a library. So it's obviously kind of the same genre. And there's this same cat. There's the same tabby cat who now invites this young woman to go on an adventure to save the libraries. And it turns out that something is threatening not just the libraries and the books, but literacy in general. And even more than the first book, this is very topical. This is a book that is obviously a fantasy story, but it is truly a mirror for the times in which we live. We live in an age, and I never thought I would see the day, that in some countries, books are being banned and sometimes even burned. This is not just like, okay, well, you shouldn't read this. No, it's literally kids don't have access to certain books. Books are being seen as a threat. And in addition to that, we have a culture where reading itself is less and less popular. And a lot of the kids today have such short attention spans that they just cannot focus on books anymore. And you see this in the trends currently in young adult literature, in children's book literature. Books have to be shorter and shorter and shorter. Chapters have to be shorter. I was doing some research for my own novel, and I was reading, okay, well, it's epic fantasy that I'm writing, and most of epic fantasy, we're talking, 100,000 words. That's very common. However, the latest trend is less words, 70,000. Those books sell better. Why? Because just people don't give themselves the time anymore to read these huge epic stories. And so for me, it's also a bit of a challenge. What kind of book am I going to write? If it's epic fantasy, does it necessarily have to be like a brick? Or can I make it a little bit shorter and can it still be epic? Anyway, so this book, The Cat Who Saved the Library, is very much about that threat to our society, to our culture, and to our values if people forget to read, if books are being suppressed. Now, don't worry, it's not a very political book, although there are some very hard hitting passages in there, and there are some amazing quotes about our culture and the world in which we live. But it stresses the importance of reading, it stresses the value of books, not just for entertainment, but to form us and to preserve values in our society. It's one of those books that just makes you think and really helps you to discern how important it is to talk about the importance of books and to value fantasy literature, fiction. Because if we lose the ability to read, if we lose the ability to reach people with stories, then we lose something that is essential to our culture and to what makes us and keeps us human. The book is a little bit redundant. I felt it was a bit more on the nose than the first book. On the other hand, I can't really complain because I think that the theme of this book is so important that I actually think it deserves to be a little bit on the nose, just to make sure that we understand what the true message is of this book, The Cat Who Saved a Library. And that's it for this week's episode of the Quill and Candle. Follow me on Substack if you want to stay up to date with what I write, and of course also to post your comments and give me some feedback. And if you're interested in that choose your own fantasy adventure project, you definitely want to be on my mailing list. You definitely want to follow me there because that's where it's all going to happen. If you like this and you think that someone else that you know might benefit from my ramblings, pass it on. That would be wonderful. If you want to support my work, after all, I'm just a simple priest with no income, but that what you give me, I live on donations, then you can do so by going to my website, fatherroderick.com/join. I will talk to you next week. Have a wonderful week. Keep reading and keep writing. God bless.